You are watching Procurement and Supply Chain Live. Now, our next speaker is Rudy Lawrence. He is Senior Vice President, Head of Global Supply Chain and Corporate Services with Juul Labs. Now, Juul Labs are an American electronic cigarette company, and Rudy is responsible for global manufacturing, engineering, and sourcing. Rudy's worked in supply chain and operations for 20 years, having previously worked for IBM, Foxconn, Microsoft, among others. He holds a BSc and an MSc in engineering from Cornell University. And today, Rudy will be talking about supply chain regulation during re-globalization. Rudy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here today. As Sean mentioned, my name is Rudy Lawrence, and I am the Senior Vice President of Global Supply Chain and Corporate Services here at Juul Labs. I've been at Juul Labs for 4.5 years now. Juul Labs, as Sean mentioned, is a electronic cigarette company. And what's interesting and unique about Juul that I'll explain a little bit through this presentation is that we are an electronic cigarette company that kind of spans multiple industries, right? We're CPG, we're medical device, we're also technology. And so as we work through a lot of those different industries, you will notice that there are a number of regulations that we need to abide by. And so that is one of the unique things that we will talk a little bit about here today that impacts our supply chain. And then I think one of the other major topics that I wanted to share with everybody here is this term reglobalization and what does that really mean? And I think the way that I would describe reglobalization is that we're hitting new times, new interesting and challenging times, and we have to globalize in a new way. Supply chain is changing, our industries are changing, and so we are heading towards a new environment for supply chain. And it's just an interesting term to think about what our new globalization will be, because it will be different from what we had before. But before I continue, Juul Labs is an American company. We are based out of Washington, D.C. We manufacture in multiple locations in Asia as well as in the United States. For those of you who are familiar with the product and the e-cigarette industry, we have our device, which is the handheld reusable device that people purchase once. And then we have our consumables, which include our pods that include e-liquids. And those e-liquids are made in the United States and filled in the United States as well. And the combination of the device and the pods are what consumers buy for Juul Labs. So I'll explain a little bit more about our supply chain as we move forward. But as we, kind of think about what is our supply chain today, I thought that this picture was an amazing kind of story of where a lot of our technology companies are today. And this is a picture of the GM parking lot in Detroit, where you can see tons of cars. I think it's a huge parking lot. And what's unique about this picture is all these cars are waiting for some type of chip before they can get to a customer. And so this just kind of represents, all of you as supply chain leaders. This represents the issues and the impact that we've been seeing to our industries over the last few years. And it reminds me a lot of what happened with MLCCs back in 2018. And so, yes, we are being impacted severely. This is just a picture that kind of draws us into understanding the challenges that we're having and that we're facing within supply chain. But I read that over 169 industries are impacted by the semiconductor crisis. And I think it's probably more than that now. And over 8.1 million cars alone, not including all of the other products that people are looking to buy, are significantly impacted by this. So this is just setting the stage and setting the tone for the impacts that we're having across our industry. And I know we're all very, very used to that. And I think when we talk about Juul Labs, It's a unique industry, as I mentioned before, because we do span across CPG, we span across technology, we span across electronic devices and the medical space. And so we do get the usual challenges that all of you are seeing. We have component shortages. We have longer than, very long lead times. Lead times that used to be 20 weeks are now over a year long. Our component costs are becoming astronomical, as they are for you. Logistics delays and costs are through the roof. Sometimes, traditionally for Joule, we would airship, and before the pandemic, we looked at ocean shipping. But all of those costs have continued to increase for us. Resource availability has become constrained, especially in our US manufacturing plants with COVID and with all of the government support for a lot of the labor. It was very hard to find the resources that we needed to continue to manufacture our product. We also had issues with just the increase in labor costs for manufacturing, because in order to have the right skilled and trained labor in the right areas, you had to be able to pay a lot higher costs than what we traditionally paid in the past. And then I think as leaders, you can't go without talking about the Great Resignation. When you talk about your engineers and your core technologists and your automation specialists, those individuals are in very high demand. And it was very, very challenging, not only for us to keep our skilled labor as it is for many of you, but it's very difficult in this competitive marketplace to keep those individuals and to find new individuals when we needed them. So those are some of the challenges that we face at Joule. I know those are the usual challenges that many of you are facing, but I wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about some of the specific challenges that we see at Joule. There, within the electronic cigarette space in the United States, it's all regulated and controlled by the FDA. And the FDA has very strict requirements. The FDA is the Federal Drug Administration here in the United States. And they control and regulate and specify exactly how we need to operate, how we need to manufacture, what are our requirements for our bill of materials, our parts, et cetera. And so, traditionally coming from the electronics space, it's very, if you have a challenge with a component, it's very easy to make a change. You find a spec or a component, or you design a spec or a component for something similar for what you're looking for. You do some tests, you do an engineering change, and you make that modification. And if it's satisfying your product needs, you can move forward. In our industry, that is not the case. We are very highly regulated, and so it would require us to do a number of testing. We have to do health studies. We have to do, product similarity studies. We have to be able to submit all of that information to the FDA and have them review and give us an approval before we can move forward. And so that is a very different requirement, very similar, I would say, to the medical industry, where you can't just make a BOM change. You have additional requirements that are needed from a BOM perspective before you can move forward. Another major thing is bullet number 2 under additional industry and regulatory requirements is all of the testing and the validation that's needed. It's not just validating to make sure that your line works. It's now validating that the process is repeatable and exactly providing the output that you have shared with the FDA. And then all of the data has to be submitted again. And so those are additional lead times that you need to add into your engineering change window. And those can be upwards of a year and more. So it's not just making a quick engineering change for a non-regulated space. It's something that does take a lot of extra time. And then the last bullet here is industry-driven logistics constraints. We, within the electronic cigarette space, have also been constrained by how we ship electronic cigarettes and the consumable within the United States. And so there are very strict partners that we're able to use. There's very strict limits on weight and what's included in the packaging and how it's shipped. And so we have to abide by all of those regulations. And so those drive additional costs, those drive constraints on times and deliveries. And so those are all things that impact the electronic and cigarette space. But it is something that is, you're able to overcome and you're able to move forward. It's just something that you need to understand and know that that's different for our space than other spaces. So now I wanted to share a little bit about the influences that we've seen within supply chain that's caused by the pandemic, whether it's economic or geopolitical. And I'm not a political scientist, but we know that because of everything that's happening in combination with the pandemic, as well as in combination with the war in the Ukraine, that is causing us as supply chain leaders to think about what we're doing differently. And I know many of you are thinking about this. We think about our business continuity. Where are we manufacturing today? What are the challenges that we have? Are we single sourced in any places? Do we need to ensure that we have the right mitigation plans and risk plans in place to ensure that our business can continue? So lots of business continuity planning is happening today. I know many of you spent time that have manufacturing sites in Asia, spent time thinking about tariffs and tariff mitigation and where should we be and should we move out of Asia or China specifically to allow our business to save some of the costs that it would cost our business to continue to operate that way. So that's a huge expense for us. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on tariffs. So that's a huge expense for us. The geopolitical nature of where our manufacturing facilities are. Again, with Ukraine and all of the uncertainty that's caused there and China's relationship with Russia, that's unclear. We sometimes think about where do we need to be just to ensure that there's no major impact to our business. Increased OpEx and supplier costs. All of our suppliers, again, I talked a little bit about our US facilities and how we have to pay increased dollars to keep people working in our manufacturing lines. The same thing is happening at all of our suppliers, and they're requiring additional costs to cover their expenses. And so we've seen a significant amount of increased costs across a number of our suppliers. And then again, last is labor availability, not just because of the cost aspect that I mentioned for the US, but now in Asia, right? We're seeing significant shutdowns happening with COVID in China, and some large concerns around even delivering food and supplies to people because they're not allowed to leave their homes. So they can't leave their homes, they can't come to work and provide that labor that we need to manufacture our product. So those are definitely things that we are concerned about, that we're watching. And this globalization that has happened in the past is really going to change as we think about the impacts of the pandemic and what's going to happen with the Ukraine war. So I bring about this concept of regrowth and reglobalization because I believe as supply chain leaders, we're really sitting here thinking about what is the new, people for the pandemic always would say, what is the new normal? Where are we going to be going forward? And we know we're not going to be in the same place that we were before. And so I like to think about this period as a really interesting time, a really interesting environment where we're simultaneously having a combination of some collapse as well as growth. Collapse in the sense of, if you think back to the times of the pandemic, there were many businesses that the way that they do business has just changed completely, or there's lots of places that are out of business, right? And the same thing with our supply chain. The way that we did things in the past is completely different than how we do it now, right? We never imagined a world where we would be running global supply chains over Zoom, and that's happening. And significant number of new companies and new industries have come out of all of the changes that happened from the pandemic. And I think we're going to see the same thing happen with companies as we go through this Ukraine-Russia war and see how that impacts all of the other countries that are related, aka China and Asia. And so I just like to think about this as a period of significant change, a time of uncertainty, but also a positive time for growth in some aspects. And I just mentioned for the second bullet, I just mentioned that the Ukraine war is an immense impact. I think not only on food supply and not only on oil supply, we hear a lot about, but again, what's the impact going to be on the economy and multiple economies that are now downstream impacts of what happens with the war. And for all of us that do have a presence in Asia, that is something that is consistently, on our minds. We have a presence in the UK as well, and that is a huge market for Juul Labs. The UK government is actually very favorable on electronic cigarettes, and they believe that there's a significant opportunity to impact the health of those who choose to continue to smoke and ingest nicotine. And so here at Juul Labs, we are super focused on providing a unique and different alternative to combustible cigarettes for adult smokers. All at the same time, we look to reduce the youth usage impact. And so UK being a big market for us, we want to understand what the impacts of this war is going to be in Ukraine and how that's going to impact people, within Europe and within the UK. So those are some things that we always think about. China's participation in the global system. China is huge. It's a huge market. Everybody knows it's a huge market, and they've been a part of this global system. And now we wonder what's going to happen. Are they going to continue to play the same role that they play in the past? Is this going to be a new global system that's created, and how is that going to impact China? And what's the downstream economic impacts that's going to come from that? Is that going to impact all of our businesses and the way we work moving forward? And again, this concept of reglobalization is really around the way that we did things in the past is going to significantly impact how things are done in the future, right? We're going to see how that change happens and how we do things moving forward. And I think the biggest piece that I want you to take away from this is as supply chain leaders, it's really critical for us to think about how all of these things that are happening around reglobalization, around economic impact, around geopolitical impacts, around the collapse and regrowth, we should really think about how this impacts our teams. And as leaders, we should think about how these uncertain times are making our employees think about, their careers and what they're doing. And so our leadership requires empathy. It requires additional hands-on engagement. It requires additional rethinking about how and what we do and why we do it, because as leaders, we have to drive our business forward and try to be a step ahead of what we want to do strategically with our groups and with our teams. And so as I think again about this regrowth and this reglobalization, it's for us as leaders to think about what do we think is going to happen next? How do we think about the external impacts of this reglobalization? And what are the internal impacts to our teams? And what are the things that we can do to ensure that our teams do feel like they have our support, and that we are providing the right empathy and the right thinking and the right thought leadership moving forward. So at Juul Labs, we are definitely thinking strategically about many of these things. and we talk about it every day as a leadership team. But I want to thank everybody here for listening, and I wanted to open it back up to Sean so that we can talk a little bit more about this concept of reglobalization.
Thank you very much, Rudy. That's a really insightful look at a vertical market. I think many of us don't know a great deal about, the sort of e-cigarette market, and I thought it was really interesting. Some of the things you were mentioning there, China in particular. Such a key part of everything, isn't it, going forwards? And I'm interested to know, you have some manufacturing capacity out there, don't you, Rudy, in China?
Mm-hmm.
And with the ongoing zero tolerance to COVID out there, it's causing huge disruption there, isn't it? It is. And I also know you have some manufacturing capacity in the US. As a company, are you looking at reshoring some of that overseas manufacturing capacity as a way to safeguard your supply chain against future disruption?
Yeah, we really do believe a lot in China, and we have a significant amount of team members in China. And so we really do believe that we should look at it and that we should understand what's happening in the market. But right now I've listened to a lot of podcasts and participated in a number of sessions where we talk about what's going to happen with China. And there's companies that are investing additional dollars in China, and there's companies that are thinking about reshoring. Strategically, we're thinking about it, but right now we're in the mode of wanting to continue to invest. We want to invest in our people. We want to invest in the region and in the area within China. But definitely strategically, we're thinking about, are there other things that we should do to reshore? But as of right now, we're choosing to reinvest in China.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a huge undertaking, isn't it? Reshoring. I mean,
it is.
And it was. I also thought it was really interesting. The way that you, at the end, were keen to give your headline message to other supply chain managers that one of the most important things at the moment in this constant state of flux that the world is in is the teams that work under you.
Mm-hmm.
How has all this affected your team, Rudy, over the past couple of years, and what challenges has that faced you with?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like as I mentioned in the, just a few minutes ago, we have a significant number of individuals that are in China that are a part of our team that we haven't seen in 2.5 years, right? We traditionally would visit them pretty often. Somebody from our US team or our European team would travel and visit the team, and they've been isolated, really. And I know for sure that that's been a significant major impact. And as much as we want to say that Zoom is great and we can see everybody on video, there's still a little bit missing from that relationship when you can't sit down with somebody face to face and walk the manufacturing line with them and go to dinner. And so it's been a significant psychological impact, I believe, for the teams that are in China. And I think even for the teams that are in the US or in the UK, we haven't been able to see them as much as we wanted to see them. Even individuals that live in your same state in the US, everybody's on Zoom. And so there's a significant impact that we've seen with our teams. I think for a short period of time, it worked well, and it's working. We're figuring it out, but there's definitely, the longer this goes where we're not seeing each other as much as we would want to, the teams get a little bit stir crazy, and they definitely feel like there's a little element that's missing. And so that's one of the pieces that I think as leaders we should definitely consider when things start to open back up again. How do we get our teams together? How do we embrace them? How do we try to help create this new normal, this new reglobalization?
And your position as a company is complicated in that, as you mentioned, you're regulated by the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Interested to know, Rudy, you talked about some of the ways that affects you as a company in the big picture, but what about your job on the ground day to day? How does the FDA's oversight of your business affect your your working patterns and your responsibilities on the ground?
Yeah, it's really critical for us as a team to be really aware of what all of the requirements and regulations are, right? We can't make missteps. We can't just say, oh, I want to go make this change and go do that change. The engineering team knows that they can't just redesign anything that they want, right? There are very strict requirements and regulations and review boards and review committees to understand what's happening with our supply chain, what's happening with our designs and our technologies, and how do we want to modify if we need to modify, and what does that modification require. And we have government affairs teams and regulatory teams that we meet with so that they can go and provide their insight and talk with the FDA when needed, or understand what the FDA needs from us. And so it's a significant impact. It's a significant difference from working in other technology companies in the past, where, if you wanted to make a change for a supplier, if you wanted to add a second source, for example, you could go do it. But here in this regulated industry, it's a bigger task, and you have to be very careful with every step to ensure that you're not overstepping your bounds and not violating any of those policies.
So it makes a complicated job even more complicated.
Absolutely.
Now, I was really interested to see that picture of the GM car park. I couldn't work out what it was. At first, I thought it was like a glacier or something. But there are so many components to an e-cigarette, aren't there? Well,
yeah.
Which components are you finding it most difficult to get hold of?
All of the components that are shared with automotive and mobile phones.
Okay, right.
So I think, I made a reference to MLCC because, that was the challenge of 2018, where MLCC shortages were driving long lead times and high costs, and everybody was using MLCCs. I think now, for sure, everybody's using semiconductors in their microprocessors is a huge one, right? That's one of the main components. And then anywhere else that requires wafer technology, whether, any chip, I think is a significant impact. And so we're seeing that across the board for any of these major suppliers that do supply into automotive, supply into smart home companies, supply into mobile phone companies. A lot of that technology, may not be the same sellable chip, but it definitely would be the same wafer supply. And so we are seeing some significant challenges across the board, similar to all of the major players, especially in our micro controllers.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one. I guess it's a series of firefights, isn't it, for so many companies at the moment?
Absolutely.
Well, Rudy, thank you ever so much for your time. And on behalf of everybody who's watching this now at Procurement and Supply Chain Live, thank you for that. It was really insightful and fascinating.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
No, you're very welcome. Now, don't go away anywhere, because our next speaker will be up soon.